thing I want to say is thank you for the ceremony, and thank you for all of the prayers, and thank you for the introductions to the territory. I constantly tell young people to get involved with ceremony because it helps them to focus, to be right here, right now, in this place. When we begin anything, it's customary to acknowledge the traditional territory, the resident Indigenous peoples, and their communities. And so we're on the Anishinaabe territory here in the Huron Treaty Territory. It's also proper to acknowledge the gift of tobacco and our other medicines, because we're taught that tobacco always comes first in everything that we do. And also, as I begin, I want to acknowledge Gaia, Aki, our mother, the earth, our home here and now, and home to 700 million Indigenous peoples around the entire globe who have maintained, somewhat tenuously, and sometimes under great peril, a firm hold on their understandings of how and why they are placed exactly where they are. It seems we're increasingly reminded as societies, or as the 7 billion other people on this planet, why Indigenous peoples have fought so hard in the past and continue to fight today to remain in those sacred and well-defined places they call home, and why their voices must be heard and respected. Why they are a growing force, and why we as academics must join them in their fight for balance in a natural world we are belatedly discovering we all need to survive. Indigenous peoples have nurtured and maintained an incredible amount of traditional knowledge into the present, and we must continue to ensure as educators, as students, as lifelong learners, as Indigenous peoples, that there's a very good reason to remember and practice the wisdom in living close to the land and respecting the value and sacredness of those lands and waters. In addition, because of the times in which we're living, I also wish to acknowledge the increasing federal and provincial and judicial confirmation of the historic use and occupation of those lands and waters. Much of what has been documented by past research, and much of what has been confirmed by scientific practice. And I also want to point out things like the Great Law in its genesis in 1050. And people ask me all the time, how do you know that? And I say, I know that because the Great Law is iterated over and over and over again. And in the iteration of the Great Law, there are a number of different kinds of celestial events and other events that science has confirmed have happened. So when people say they came here, then they came to a lawless land, they're absolutely wrong. We know that. And we want everybody else to know that too. And that's just one great law in many across the entire nation that we now call Canada. So I've been invited to address the question of research, its practice, its practical application, as well as its past, present, and future relationship to the First Peoples of this land, as well as the reality and increasing presence and acceptance of Indigenous or traditional knowledge in our places of learning. Imagine, it's only taken us 600 years to get here. This means that we have to grapple with how the underlying need for acknowledgement and ultimate reconciliation between our peoples and other Canadians might be better achieved and understood within our academic institutions and ultimately across the entire country. Hopefully, my words will inspire your awareness of ways we can be of direct assistance as students, researchers, administrators, seasoned scholars, and as human beings. Our humanity will be very important as we move towards a better working and living relationship into the future. I always like to say, if we're not working together, we're not working well. So what is it that needs to be said and done to foster understanding and acceptance of First Peoples in this country? And what will enable us all to work well together to create the healing and reconciliation so long envisioned by our people and increasingly by Canadian citizens, whether long-standing residents or as newcomers to this country? And what is it we all need to hear and do as Canadians to make this country the country of all our dreams, while reigniting the dreams and visions of the First Peoples of these lands, waters, and resources, so they too have the necessary strength, willingness, and ability to live well? Because we do need to recognize that there is a continuance of those who dreamt here first. And remember, their descendants still dream those dreams today. We were here yesterday, we are here today, and we will still be here in the days and years to follow. Increasingly hopeful and working hard to reclaim an Indigenous worldview through taking direct action and personally envisioning an improved quality of life for ourselves and for 7 generations into the future. So what has been happening since the beginning that might inform and strengthen the ties which continue to bind us together as humanity on this planet? Where do we start such an important conversation? So let me begin with my own story, a story very similar to the many peoples you will encounter as research subjects and sometimes as barriers to the work you will want to delve into and complete as scholars and as practitioners at various levels of expertise and occupation. I was a child who was born to 2 residential school survivors and was raised in the city of Toronto. Both my parents came from Indigenous communities. My mother came from Manitoulin Island, and my stepfather came from Cat Lake near Sioux Lookout, which is where the Wesley comes from. The Esquimaux comes from Manitoulin Island. They came out of residential school. They spent 20 years in residential school between them at Shingwalk Residential School. And they brought with them all of that pain and all of that misunderstanding of how and ways to resolve it. So alcoholism was one of the key elements that they used to try to quell the voices that they heard in their heads and the voices and the pain that they experienced in their bodies. I grew up with that kind of violence. I grew up with abandonment, neglect, because they didn't understand. They had no way of knowing how kids should be raised and the kinds of things that children needed. They didn't know about going to the park and going to the zoo and doing those kinds of things. There was very little direction in a lot of the people that came out of the generation that I'm of. And yet somehow we managed to succeed. And the reason we managed to succeed is because we had other people who chose to take an interest in our well-being, sometimes on the negative side, but mostly on the positive side, so we were able to move forward. Like many in my generation, I dropped out of school at age 16. I struggled with racism in the school system. I got called a squaw, and I got called a lot of other unpleasant names. But then one of the things that I did was when I hit 19, I moved to Southern California. I moved away from where I was living, and I came to realize that it wasn't just me, as much it was the environment in which I was living and how I was reacting to what was happening around me. Interestingly, the wealth and the power of the Indigenous peoples in Palm Springs, California, because of the relationship and history that they have shared, had changed everything from my reactions to responses to those things that were happening around me, and I saw that there was something different. And I brought that different back with me, and it informed my life. And then from there, I was able to move into some multiple educational experiences that changed the trajectory of my life to where it is today. And that's the kind of stuff that research and the kind of things that we talk about and the kinds of sharing our stories have the effect of actually having helped us do. So my doctoral research was done in Anishinaabe Nation, and my focus of interest was the resonance of unresolved trauma and grief into the present. I had had that experience. I wanted to understand it. It was based upon my earlier studies, and later I learned that others in the United States were also examining the impacts of tribal suffering and were beginning to write similar stories and opening up and exploring similar theories and conversations. What had happened? Who were we? Why were we struggling as much as we were? I believe we were starting to tap into the collective unconscious of our peoples as we wrote, and I'll tell you why as we move forward. My master's work was a comparative analysis of the aftermath of the bubonic plagues in Europe and the epidemics on this continent, and how this affected the mental health and well-being of Indigenous peoples continentally. I now know many Indigenous peoples and others have been impacted in similar ways, and this is a continuing story. Over the past 30 years, through my own research and writing, I've come to discover that there are many pathways to and from knowledge acquisition in our communities, and therefore our researchers must be really adept at speaking human before they can reach through and navigate the implications of long-standing impacts from external agencies and government policies to actually touch the knowledge base that exists at the center of Indigenous understanding. The people you will encounter have been researched far too long to be fooled by you. Times have changed, and there's a strong and oft-stated need for them to confirm and guide the research you will propose, and they will direct you to the conclusions for yourself as a learner and for them as a community. You are, and perhaps will be, practicing what you call research and caregiving, and they are practicing what Gerald Visner calls survivance. And they've been doing this since settlers arrived on this continent almost 600 years ago. In fact, many are now counter-researching academic research, reconstructing their stories from their own perspectives and reconstituting their own research practices. Because whether you acknowledge it or not, Indigenous knowledge itself is firmly grounded in deep learning, critical observation, and sound and recognizable research practices. And yours? While sometimes others take liberties with our realities. How many of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yeah. Well, that was stolen from the Blackfoot Nation. Maslow spent a lot of time with Blackfoot. He observed how they were living and the kinds of things that they did, and he wrote it up as his own work. And Ryan Heavyhead and a number of other researchers have subsequently gone back and noted that it was his graduate students that said to Maslow, "You've got to tell the truth. You've got to go back out there and tell the world where you got this information. And I don't think he did, but we will. We'll make sure that you know. There's also an anthropologist while I was in doing research at the University of Toronto, and then I was going through the stacks reading a bunch of documents looking for something very specific, and I came across a paper called Pine Island. I thought, oh, that's interesting, so I started to read it. It was about my family. I recognized everybody in it. I was like, whoa, this is my family. So I took it back. I made copies from my family. We went down to the lake and we sat down together and we read it. And I have to tell you that my family critique was, that's all BS. He made that up. So taking license is not necessarily something that we approve of, but it's been going on for a very long time. So that counter research is a very important part of it. So there are many approaches to knowledge gathering in our communities, and therefore in some ways you'll have to abandon everything you've been taught at university, bracket it, set it aside, reframe it, and allow other streams of knowledge and practice in. I'm not asking you to throw away what you've been taught, just try not to lead with it. Your expression of humanity is much more effective and appealing to those around you than any demonstration of your intellectual prowess. They neglected to tell us this when I was in a doctoral stream. They spoke of note-taking, filing, compiling stats, computer programming, approaching gatekeepers, to a lesser extent than was actually necessary in the field, and all the technical and social aspects of data collection, but they did not speak to the emotional impact of environmental isolation, the spiritual and mental consequences of Indigenous suicide, or the letting go of inappropriate biases and beliefs prior to my on-site arrival. So let me tell you a little bit about that. I did my doctoral work in Muskrat Dam in Anishinaabe, and I remember arriving thinking, well, I'm Indigenous, I think I know something about Indigenous people. Now, I quite deliberately went into the north because I'm from the south, and I didn't want to sort of take all that sort of understanding that I had and have it block. Well, they just said, not only do you not know anything, we're just going to strip you right down naked. You won't have anything left of who you are. And that took a few months, but they did it. And then they actually came back and replaced it with their truths, with their understandings, you know, with their ceremony, with their knowledge. And it was an incredible gift from them. Their reality was sometimes harsh, but deeply honest. And I remember, as being up there for the first 3 months and feeling completely isolated from anything that I had ever known or done or said or been. And I remember when I putting on Taj Mahal, I finally somebody brought me a cord for my cereal finally, and I just cried at the sudden realization of how different I was and what this kind of place was and here I was. So I think that we need to talk a lot more. When you're doing research, you need to know a little bit more about not only the places and things that you're going to be looking at, but what's happening inside here and who you are before you step out the door and try to do that. And what of things like suicide? What does this story awaken in you? And what is your immediate go-to in your knowledge and understanding? When you go into remote places, there are the kinds of things these are the kinds of things you'll be confronted with. Not always, but quite frequently. What happens when you're in a small community of 230 people and children start taking their own lives? When children tell you of violence, family addictions, and nights spent in fear? When kids are too tired to learn because of fighting and dysfunction they can't possibly understand in their homes? The lack of space for sleeping, and a hunger too deep to describe. Are you able to link this behavior to the long history of impact, loss, marginalization, colonization, intangible privileges expressed through the decisions made on high? And I'm not speaking about the creator here when I say on high. I'm talking about government and scholarly and social decisions framed in injustice and arrogance by those who thought they knew better. And what about things like suicide spirits and religious divisions? There was a lot of learning that goes on in these communities, a lot of sharing about the kinds of experiences that these people have themselves, and an understanding has to be built. When we started having suicides happen in the community, we were burying a kid every 2 weeks. And the stories around that, I could tell you a lot about that, but I remember specifically the young people coming to me and saying, they wanted to talk about the suicide spirits. And we had a conversation about, well, what are the suicide spirits? And as we talked about it, I understood over the course of time that really those suicide spirits were an expression of Wendigo. And for those of you that know anything about Wendigo, you know that that is a concept that is sort of evolved around starvation. And I thought, yes, it's not physical starvation that they're talking about, but a spiritual and emotional starvation. Although certainly physical hunger was still very present. Those are the things that you need to understand when you do research in these communities. And what about the power of the church to silence and frighten? And I remember talking to some of the men in the community who talked about the fear that they had for the children and themselves, and how the dreams they had told them that something was wrong, very wrong there. I remember a man telling me about how he stayed away from the church because of what he saw there living under the church that he couldn't necessarily express, but he didn't want to have any influence on himself and his life and his children's lives. There's a lot of Christianity in the community, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody absolutely embodies it in the same kind of a way. So where does this information go inside of you? How might you react and be of true service and find true understanding? Because this is the foundation of your work. Being of service in the short term while you undertake your research and practice, and in the very, very long term while you live out your life, the now keeper and carrier of knowledge and experience you will have acquired and will never ever forget. Will you have the courage, the stamina, or even the desire to argue for another reality, to challenge status quo, to ask very hard questions that may deepen silences already deemed impossible to break? It will be hard on both sides of the conversation. The Indigenous side in response to your even having the audacity to ask and wanting to know, and the intense difficulty of revealing pain born out of such intensely private experiences. And because on the non-Indigenous side, because in spite of many, many years of delving into these personal stories, denial still runs very deep. These challenges stand in so many ways in front of our ability to create the reconciliation necessary to heal the pain of many. So whose truth will you be confronting? Theirs? Yours? Canada's? Because without truth, justice, and healing, there can be no genuine reconciliation. Reconciliation is not just about closing a sad chapter of Canada's past, but about opening new healing pathways of reconciliation that are forged in truth and justice. The importance of truth-telling in its own right should not be underestimated. It restores human dignity of victims. Without truth, justice cannot be served. Healing cannot happen, and there can be no genuine reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Speaking to survivors and allies at the Traditional Knowledge Keepers Forum in June of 2014, Elder Dave Cushane posed a critical question. I said, when you talk about truth, whose truth are you talking about? The Commission's answer to Elder Cushane's question is that by truth, we mean not only the truth revealed in government documents, but also the truth of lived experiences as told to us by survivors and intergenerational survivors as well. We know that there has been more than enough talk in some critical areas, and now it's time for action. Keeping in mind that in some instances, the only way to get information and knowledge moving into the community, political or academic process, is to mobilize and support the necessary learning yourself. To activate the 94 TRC calls for action, we will need to reactivate the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. It was tabled in 1996, and it's now 20 years later. It's the anniversary of. Its promises need to be moved. And move the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from aspirational to fully implemented, something that the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada has recently confirmed. They've said yes. And so we, as a people, as a country, I think have an obligation to ensure that it happens. We will need to work together to provide the knowledge and assistance without judgment on both sides. Call for Action 45 asks for a jointly developed Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation, going back to 1763. The original proclamation. They wanted to be issued by the Crown, something that would certainly provide guidance for not only Indigenous peoples, but all Canadians as we frame a new relationship. Call for Action 53 asks for the establishment of a National Council for Reconciliation. A National Council for Reconciliation. Important because we need to create, support, and retain allies. There's 2 million Indigenous peoples in this country. There's 33 million other people. We cannot do this alone. We need the support and the resources and the voices of everybody across the country to make it happen. Someone, will it be you, has to take the lead and stand as ambassadors for reconciliation indefinitely until it's a normative dialogue across the entire country. There are 99 honorary witnesses that were put in place by the Commission. And those 99 witnesses have taken on a lifetime of actually doing this work as well. So you're not alone. They were there to help guide you through the process. Think about it. It will not be enough for us to say, you must learn about and integrate Indigenous knowledge and cultural mores, and then stand by and watch people struggle as they decide what is essential and what is not. Our voices are important in this conversation. I know for far too many years Indigenous people have been told that they have to answer all these questions, and sometimes we're absolutely sick of it, but we have to be there. This is a critical time in history, and we have to answer. We have to be able to provide that knowledge base. Indigenous peoples have asked for a nation-to-nation relationship, and the new federal government of Canada has agreed. They've said yes. Therefore, providing the kind of knowledge required and supported by the Indigenous community is and what will continue to be essential. How will we do this? Well, we can, we can reframe stories like I had an Indigenous child in Thunder Bay who was being taught the discovery of the America story. How can we provide other examples of other stories? There are many other options. The assumption that just because it was the Dark Ages in Europe doesn't mean it was the Dark Ages everywhere else. Our children are still being colonized by these stories, and so are the children of other cultures. So rise up is what I say, and offer alternatives and learn about our creation stories, and hand those creation stories to teachers, so it's not just the Doctorate of Discovery story, it's the 5 or 6 creation stories from across Canada, because there are other stories equally as valid. We have to make a formal and inclusive case for change. So what does it mean? It means we all have to confront our realities. We all have to speak honestly to what is happening in our communities and what we need, and we have to know exactly what we want to say. We have to demonstrate positive and powerful faith that change can happen. We have had many people move before us to this place. This didn't just miraculously happen when all the stars aligned and we had a government that said yes in Ontario and the federal government. We have had a lot of people pushing. My grandfather, Lorenzo Big Canoe, used to say that the Indian Act and all of the government was like a rubber wall. He said you can push and push and push. He said, and it'll move. But the minute you stop pushing, it bounces right back to where it started. So we've got to take down the rubber wall. And we have to provide a clear and accessible roadmap to where we want to go. So I'm asking communities in a lot of different places as I'm moving across the country, are you ready? Are you ready? Do you know exactly what you want? Do you know what those gaps are, and do you know what it's going to cost to fill them? Because we have to arrive with the solution, because we already know what we need. We just need to make sure that we codify it in ways that are understandable on the other side. And ask yourself, because I had to as well, what's your practice now? And let me suggest that you go inclusive. Even if it means holding your nose until it feels right, because I've already said if we're not working together, we're not working well. There are many heavy concepts and questions to be addressed, but they're entirely legitimate in this particular day and age, and are necessary to all residents of this country. We have all moved to a place of survivance as a country, and we must look at the consequences of every one of our actions into the future. Please know Indigenous peoples remain deeply conscious that they are living in a country incoming settlers claimed as their own. A country far too many newcomers and long-standing residents have carelessly littered with half-stories and broken dreams. Remember, Europeans had come to this land with spirits damaged by persecution and grief in Europe, but unfortunately, over time, they have steadily and unerringly recreated the oppression they experienced there, here, on this continent. As respected Indigenous elder George Seawee noted, in 5 centuries, the limit of the Americas' material strength, once thought without possible limits not so long ago, has been reached, and some of us might now add, and dangerously exceeded. This country is now sick with maladies shamefully similar to the ones first Euro-Americans had fled by coming here. New and epidemic diseases defy conventional medicine, economic oppression of the poor, whose ranks are inexorably growing and burgeoning with children from all backgrounds, has become an apparently insoluble problem. The natural world is threatened with extinction because of the aggressive political and financial interests of leading elites. Justice systems are subject to the dictatorship of organized crime and in some instances our own government. And we are confronted as a nation, as a people, with far too many negative points of similarity between Euro-America and ancient pre-American Europe. Rising up, Indigenous scholars have found through their own work and writing that directness is the only way to prompt the kind of change needed in this country. Everyone and everything must be turned around. They have known for a long time that the correct direction will not be found in the hands of government. It must come from us, from our humanity, from our caring, and our respect for each other. Several years ago, I attended a governance meeting with some very influential people who asked the question, what can we do to fix the issues plaguing Aboriginal peoples in Canada? And when the question came around to me, I was very clear. I suggested they get the hell out of the way. stop interfering in the rebuilding and assertion of decision-making at community and political levels. I came home and wrote a paper entitled Legacy, Genocide by Paper, which addressed the question of the violence of benevolence perpetrated and perpetuated by the Canadian state against Indigenous peoples. We've been helped almost to the death. What this government needs to do is get out of the way, cease to help, and learn to respond when asked for assistance for the very things requested, and only those things. They cannot fix anything, and this has been the most difficult understanding to impart. It is not our job, no matter who we are outside of the confines of a community itself, to fix the Indigenous community. It is our job to stop perpetuating the damages we have wrought through our constant interference, and take action only when required, when asked, and when directed. No, what Indigenous peoples are looking for now is a solid plan of mutual and proactive action, and perhaps even the establishment of things such as a National Indigenous Brain Bank, so we can more easily and effectively rally troops and allies to engage in a new kind of battle in a new kind of world. Action includes the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, now fully accepted by Canada, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Children. And stepping outside of the 1876 Indian Act, a wholly and solely antiquated piece of federal legislation. What will happen if we all acknowledge and implement the 94 calls to action under the TRC? And we endorse the development and implementation of curriculum that encompasses the entire spectrum of learning, including Indigenous languages and knowledge from K through PhD in our schools and places of business and worship. Finally, what kinds of research make sense in this day and age? Are we basing our research on what is known, or are we venturing out into the unknown? As I noted earlier, my research on the effects of unresolved trauma and grief on Indigenous populations, and my master's research on the aftermath of the bubonic plagues in Europe and the epidemics on this continent, or what was ostensibly called the New World, happened almost 20 years ago, and yet we are only now opening widely accepted conversations on trauma-informed research and dialogues in ministries and scholarly places. So we know it takes a while to get to where we need to go. At the time that I opened these topics, I was told that at least where I wanted to take them, it was not considered solid research or even doable. I was told they were not in the literature, although Indian residential schools were, so I should start there. I believed, however, that the damages were much further back than Indian residential schools, so I went back to Contact. And the reason I did that is when I was about 36 years old, I went to a spa, and one of the parts of my spa experience was a 50-minute session with a psychologist. And I walked into this room, and the guy said, "Have a seat." And he asked me my name, I think, but he didn't ask me anything else. He didn't ask me where I came from. He didn't ask me about any of the knowledge, who I was, or anything like that. And he said, "Okay." He said, "So, he put on this really, music. He said, "We're going to regress you. We're going to regress you." And I said, "Oh, God, do I have to take off my clothes?" No. He said, "You're going to get in the," he said, "We're going to walk," he said, "Close your eyes, and we're going to walk down the street where you live." Now, I have, as an Indigenous kid being raised by residential school parents in the 60s in Toronto, I moved every other month, right? So I'm like, okay, what street? So I finally grabbed a street, and then he says, "Okay, we're going to go into your little house there with the white picket fence," and I'm thinking, not in my neighborhood. And then he said, "We're going to go into the house," and he said, "You're going to go to the hall, and you're going to go into your bedroom, and there's a closet. When you open the closet, you're going to step into the closet, and the closet is going to be like an elevator. And when I start to count you down, you're going to go down, down, down." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "When I say stop, you're going to step out the door, and you're going to tell me what you see." Sounds good. So I get in the elevator, he starts counting down, he says stop, the elevator doors open, and what I am confronted with absolutely undoes me, and I start to cry. And I mean, not pretty cry either, like sob, snot, everything, right? Woo! Yeah. So he's like, "Get in the elevator! Get back in the elevator!" And I'm like, oh. So he finally gets me back in the elevator, and he counts me back up to the top. And he says, "Okay, thank you, that's your 50 minutes, right?" I'm like, "Thank you." And I cried for 4 months. Okay? I cried when I was shopping. I cried when I was driving the car. I cried when I was looking after my kids. I finally had to go to a real psychologist and say, "Please, you've got to put me back together again." And let me tell you, first of all, don't try that at home, okay? It's really dangerous. But also, let me tell you what I saw and the reason why I do the research I do and why it's so important to me. When that door opened, what I was confronted with was what I perceived to be an ocean of grief. It was so big and so dark and so scary that it completely undid me. I thought, oh my God, if that's my grief, I will never be able to heal that. I will never be able to be okay. And later I realized, after a fair bit of research or therapy, that was actually the grief of nations. That was the tears of nations that had, and so we have a lot of work to do. I was just talking about, okay. But I came through that. But let me tell you, those are the kinds of things, those kind of epiphanies that are very important to our work. Yes, okay, so I know known research would encompass things like learning about any residential schools or homelessness in Canada, or all those kinds of things, at least from a very specific kind of a perspective. I had a student who wanted to study homelessness in Toronto, and he said, he went through the whole thing, poverty and all that. And I said, why don't you take a different kind of a tactic when you look at this kind of research? Why don't you look at who Indigenous peoples actually are, where they came from, how they followed the hunt, that they migrated to the places where the resources were, and do the story on homelessness from that perspective. And I'll tell you, this kid learned a huge amount of things. He's not Native, but he went all the way through to PhD from undergraduate degree, studying Native, Indigenous knowledge. He's very knowledgeable to this day. So we have to make sure that those kinds of things, because they're invaluable in your learning journey. But what's also necessary right now is innovative and very deep ways to take your learning journey out to the streets and ensure it gets known outside of the academy, outside of the, your colleagues. Take it to Rotary, take it to the public library, take it to the Lions Club, take your research to places where people will learn something and it'll change the face of Aboriginal Canada across the whole country. As I've noted many times before, what gets said at our dinner tables is also extremely important, because it's what's said there that does get taken out to the streets and made real. So watch what you say when you think you're having a private conversation at home, because it's your kids that are going to take it out to the street and make it real. And ask yourself, what did you learn at the tables in your home? And what are you making real? The unknown, which has always interested me and isn't always in the literature, might encompass things like examining the concept of blood memory and its implications for reconstituting language and spiritual knowledge. There's been a lot of suffering around the entire world. What are we as recipients of our genetics, of our family trees, of historic traumas manifesting in our own lives out of those familial experiences? Research has shown us that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors have genetic markers of the trauma their grandparents suffered. And this is amazing, right? Are we to argue that Indigenous peoples do not exhibit the same? Or finally, and albeit belatedly, will we acknowledge that the policies and practices in this country have resulted in an intergenerational resonance that is visible throughout the Indigenous population in varying degrees? Are we willing to finally do something concrete about it? I'm going to ask you to always ask yourself what the value of your research and practice is, not only to the literature you're studying or the immediate caring you're offering and ultimately contributing to, and not only because of the degree you have or will receive, but also to the first peoples of the territory which you are studying, and perhaps more importantly, to humanity in general. We can no longer afford to be complacent and expect things to be as they are today, tomorrow. Heads up, humanity is on a very fast path, and it's a path which never seems to get us to enough. Let me also share with you, when an elder once said to me, and which has deeply influenced me, Elder Fred Wheatley, now long deceased, once said, you have to live in the world in which you find yourself. An important and seemingly simple observation. But let me remind you to be very observant, very clear, and very present in the world in which you find yourself today, because it is not the world of our ancestors, and it will not be the world of our tomorrow. Elders strongly feel the presence of absence, something that was brought to my attention through an article in the Walrus several years ago. When young people look at the world in which we're living, they see it as it is: highly polluted, diminishing fresh water, soaring skyscrapers, high cost of living, and a burgeoning global population. Likely very normal to them in so many ways, just the way it is. Elders and seniors see the same thing, but they also see what was and is no longer. Clear streams, drinkable lake water, open meadows, clear skies, neighborly behaviors, and these are superimposed upon the devastation they see around them today. There have been dramatic changes in our lifetime. Ask yourself, is there more to come? Or will we awaken to some hard realities and shift the trajectory of our decisions to reflect what 370 Indigenous peoples around this planet have not stopped saying? There are so many questions that need answers, whether it's about residential schools, FASD, drug addiction, suicide, unjust policy and practice. How do we keep kids in school and unravel tightly narrated definitions of education so we can better meet the needs of coming generations? And what about diabetes and its increasing presence around the globe? Northern stores have their food delivered to them by plane. It would be possible to quantify the impact of chips and pop on traditional peoples just by going backwards and reviewing the increase of those artificial foods in northern diets for those people living in what are now artificial communities. What kinds of research will make sense and help us to get to where we need to go? Look at the National Food Delivery Program. Program funding amounted to $27.6 million in 2003 and 4. However, due to rising volumes and fuel costs, total program costs had increased to $47.8 million in 2007 and 8. And the last time I checked, it had increased to $52 million to feed about 140 communities, roughly 100,000 eligible people. Most of these are Aboriginal communities located in 3 territories in Labrador, northern portions of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Does this make sense to you? Can we not make better decisions about food security, given that we as a society were the ones who destroyed their traditional economies? And what about oxy babies now entering schools and experiencing the kinds of neurological damages never seen before in children? New stuff that needs exposure, research, and community-informed solutions. When we come back to the question of traditional knowledge, applied research, and professionalizing Indigenous and trauma-informed research, I hope you can see the pathways threaded through the discussions that I presented. It's a story we must go back to go forward to resolution and partnership. We have scholars on all sides now. We have increasing and legitimate access to traditional knowledge, and we must work together to inform business, mining interests, and to inform and control development, and to educate our children, all of them, for the future. So if your pathways to a deeper understanding of the wills and wounds of humanity, please tread the road less traveled, and work hard to find a new lens to view your research questions through. Include the worldviews and deep understandings of the Indigenous community, because if the prophecies are correct, it is they who will lead us all home, back to the land, back to relationship, and back to a future with hope and health for everyone. In closing, the words of Chief Dan George from over 35 years ago seem fitting. He said, "Am I to come as a beggar and receive all from your omnipotent hand? Somehow I must wait. I must find myself. I must find my treasure. I must wait until you want something of me, until you need something that is me. Then I can raise my head and say to my wife and family, listen, they're calling. They need me. I must go." Thank you.